Within the Goldberg variations, the 25th variation is arguably the most distinctive. To begin with, it is one of only 3 variations in the minor mode, G minor in other words, but even more crucially, in this variation, Bach ventures the furthest away harmonically from the home key of G, and this daring exploration of remote harmonic constellations occurs alongside music that is intensely poignant, leading the musicologist and critic Donald Francis Tovey to describe it as a song of sorrow. Indeed, the remaining 5 variations have the almost impossible task of transporting us back to the more harmonically and emotionally comfortable world of the opening aria. Recognizing the uniqueness of this variation, the harpsichordist Wanda Landowska, who in many respects reintroduced the Goldberg variations to 20th century audiences, considered it the black pearl among the 30 variations. The trouble is that from an aesthetic viewpoint, the 20th century has tended to equate profundity and depth of feeling with a slow tempo. Add to that the fact that Bach marked the variation Adagio, and you have the perfect recipe for a performing tradition that not only favors playing the piece too slowly, at least in my opinion, but also playing it in a way that strips it from any possible references to dance forms. Because of course, we would not want something as mundane as a dance interfere with our profundity and depth of feeling. What I would like to do in this video is something I have also done in previous videos devoted to Bach's music, and that is to peel away some of the layers of 20th century tradition in order to arrive at a more nuanced understanding of this variation. Let's start by addressing the implied claim of the title of the video, namely whether this variation relates in any way to a Polonaise. While I don't actually have a definite answer, let me explain why I think there may very well be a connection there and how thinking of the piece in those terms gave me some ideas on how to shape the music. The first thing to keep in mind is that what we're generally dealing with in this context are not actual Polonaise, but rather stylized dances that could incorporate some aspects or reminiscences of what German composers would consider a Polish style. And while there were areas in Germany, most specifically Dresden, that had a stronger connection to actual Polish music, trying to find common characteristics among 18th century German Polonaise can be fairly challenging. What we might mostly expect is a piece in triple meter and in 3/4 time, without an upbeat, although interestingly enough, one of Bach's own Polonaise, which is a section within the last movement of the first Brandenburg Concerto, challenges 2 of those expectations since it is in 3/8 time and begins with an upbeat. Incidentally, there are only 3 pieces by Bach titled Polonaise, the one I just mentioned, one in the 2nd orchestral suite, and one in the 6th French suite. The Polonaise from the 6th French suite is also indicative of how loose the concept of a Polonaise can be. Not only is it quite different in character compared to the other 2 Polonaises by Bach, in one manuscript it is labeled as a menuet polonais, in other words, a Polish minuet. Perhaps the most eloquent example of how vague the genre of the Polonaise could be in 18th century Germany is a set of 12 Polonaise written by Bach's son, Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, and especially those that are in minor tonalities. I posted a video of Wilhelm Friedemann Bach's Polonaise in E minor about a year and a half ago, and I would like to turn to this Polonaise once again right now, because I find that its opening material has an uncanny similarity to the 25th variation of the Goldbergs. Let's take a closer look at the opening measures of the two pieces. So on top, you see the first line of Bach's 25th variation from the Goldberg variations, and in the bottom, you see the opening line of Wilhelm Friedemann Bach's Polonaise in E minor. Now, the first thing I would like to do is to play those opening lines, starting with the variation number 25. And here's now Wilhelm Friedemann Bach's Polonaise. So I hope you can see that there are a few similarities here, and I want to start with the left hand, which I think is quite similar in several respects. First of all, you can see that we have this semi-constant motion of eighth notes, and I will talk about how this gives me some ideas on how to shape them. But the other thing is that they both have a generally downwards slope, especially the top line of the left hand. So in the Bach we have this, and in the Friedemann Bach we have this. So very similar, especially this ending where in the Bach variation it's, and the Friedemann Bach Polonaise. So to me this is very, very similar. The other thing I would say has to do with the melody. Now these are slightly different, but you could tell that the leaps that are grace notes in the variation, in other words this idea, here we have in the Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, they have been almost amplified to. So we have this kind of leap that has become even more of a leap in the Polonaise. And once again, the line itself, the melodic line, seems to be descending in both pieces. So what I would say as a preliminary remark in terms of phrasing is that what I do in these eighth notes in the left hand is that I think of them in groups of two, since we have 3 beats to the measure and there are 2 eighth notes in each beat. What I do is I think of the first one as longer and the second one shorter. What this means is, and I'm going to exaggerate the effect, that in the variation from the Goldbergs, it would be something like this. Which is the exact same thing that I did back when I actually played the Wilhelm Friedemann Bach Polonaise. Now, while the relationship of the 25th variation to a Polonaise may still be tentative, to me at least, it is revealing that Wilhelm Friedemann Bach found enough aspects of a Polonaise in it and modeled his own Polonaise on this variation, even if he would then go on to explore a radically different musical terrain in the rest of this Polonaise. Before continuing to discuss phrasing and articulation, I would like to move up a level, so to speak, and look at some more general considerations regarding the choice of instrument, as well as choosing a tempo. There is no ambiguity in terms of what instrument Bach had in mind, because he specifically calls for a harpsichord with two manuals, two keyboards in other words, on the title page of the published score. Furthermore, at the beginning of each variation, he specifies whether that particular variation should be performed on one manual or two manuals, although in some variations he leaves the choice up to the performer. For the 25th variation, Bach specifies two manuals, meaning that each hand is going to be playing on a different keyboard. Now, let's talk about this a little bit, because there's a misconception I often encounter, and I would like to clear this up. In terms of texture, it is easy to look at this variation as being mostly homophonic, with the right hand having the melody and the left hand being the accompaniment. Of course, that's not exactly the whole story, but that could be the subject of a separate video. Following this line of reasoning, I've often encountered the view that the logic behind Bach wanting this variation played on two manuals is that since the upper manual is softer than the lower manual, the left hand accompaniment is played on the upper manual and thus remains subdued, while the melody can be brought out by the right hand playing on the louder lower manual. This is not exactly accurate. In some harpsichords, including mine, the upper manual is indeed slightly softer than the lower manual. However, the crucial difference between the two manuals, and this is true of all harpsichords, is not so much a difference in volume as much as a difference in sound quality or timbre. The reason for this difference is that the keys of each manual pluck a different set of strings, and each set of strings is plucked at a different point relative to the total length of the string. And plucking a string at a different point is going to favor different overtones. What this means is that playing each hand on a different manual doesn't have as much to do with bringing out the melody and keeping the so-called accompaniment secondary, which is the way modern pianists are almost forced to think, because modern pianos are cross-strung and all the sound basically comes out from one region of the soundboard. So musical lines have to be differentiated in terms of volume. Playing each hand on a different manual is rather about creating a dialogue or an interplay between two musical lines by assigning each line a different quality of sound. And of course, this is not about whether harpsichord music can or should be played on the piano. I don't think we should impose such limits to music, even if pianists themselves seem to get a bit defensive when the opposite possibility, i.e. playing piano music on the harpsichord, is suggested. However, there are aspects of this variation that simply cannot be realized on an instrument with one keyboard. This is because Bach took full advantage of the unique possibilities offered by a two-manual harpsichord, and therefore, in every variation within the Goldbergs in which he specified the use of two manuals, there are crucial aspects that cannot be realized on any instrument with only one keyboard. I have already mentioned the concept of having a dialogue between two different timbres. Beyond that, there are also issues concerning important elements of phrasing and articulation. Each of the two manual variations is going to pose a different set of problems, but to briefly summarize, the main issue concerns those passages where the two hands either have to cross over each other or where they have to play the same note at the same time. Obviously, there are ways of faking it, but every solution comes either at the expense of phrasing, which compromises the expressive content of that passage, or at the expense of obscuring the interplay between the musical lines, since the two lines are blended into one. Let me show you what I mean by looking at the 25th variation, which is admittedly far less problematic than some of the other two manual variations, as the only really problematic passage occurs in the last measures. And what I would like to do is play this passage, first of all, using the two manuals, in other words, exactly what I'm supposed to do, and then I will play it using simply one manual. And what I'm going to do now for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to play it a little more slowly than the actual performance and a little more straight, shall we say, just so that you get an idea of how the two lines are interacting with one another, and you can also see what I'm actually doing, which notes I'm playing. And now the same thing in one manual, and notice how when we get to the end of the passage, things are going to get a little more jumbled. And this, what I did before was this kind of idea where I do this, and this is of course not really realizable in just using one manual. So what is happening here, I would say, are two things. First of all, as I had mentioned before, I'm trying to use a certain articulation where I play groups of eighth notes in the left hand, the first long and the second short, so that what I'm trying to do is this. And suddenly when I get to the end of that passage, it's very difficult to do this because, of course, there's all of this jumble, and I have to figure out a way of letting one finger get out of the way of the other one. So suddenly my phrasing and the kind of articulation that I'm using goes out the window. Same thing with whether I'm trying to do this idea, hold in every one of these passages, I'm trying to give them a little more of a momentum, let's say, by holding down the first note. That also has to go out the window a little bit. And of course, the other thing, as I mentioned, that you cannot do is this idea. because you have to do both things in one manual, and what happens is this dissonance that resolves is not really doable. And of course, when you do this the second time around, you just have a simple G. So that here we have this kind of idea. And again, we get to hear the logic of both of these lines being separate rather than both of them being merged into one line necessarily if you only have one manual. Next, let's discuss the choice of tempo. As I mentioned before, Bach marked the piece Adagio. From a modern perspective, this basically implies the adoption of a slow tempo. However, the reality is not that simple for two reasons. To begin with, Adagio can also signify an unhurried state or being at ease. In other words, it's not just about being slow. Secondly, we need to decide how to apply this unhurried feeling to this particular variation. Again, the modern tendency is to look at the right-hand melody. However, this is not really how it works. If you have watched some of my previous videos devoted to Bach's music, you will recall the fact that Bach tended to write out ornamentation or embellishments in his music, so that frequently we are dealing not with a simple melody, but rather an ornamented melody. And this is indeed the case in this particular variation. This is a generalization, of course, but when you start seeing notes that are shorter than 16th notes, chances are you're dealing with an embellished musical line. The other issue is that when it comes to Baroque music in general, tempo usually involves metrical and harmonic considerations, which, again simplifying a little bit, means that it is usually the musical material in the left hand that determines tempo. Let's look again at the first line of the score. So the first thing I would like to talk about is to really return for a moment to the left hand and talk about how to shape it. You will remember in the previous demonstration I said that what I do is I think of these eighth notes in groups of two. In other words, each beat has two eighth notes, and what I do is I play the first one longer and the second one shorter, so that what ends up happening is something like this. What I would say in terms of this unhurried feeling is that personally, I try to apply it not to the quarter note beat, but rather the eighth note pulse. So to me, what I just did this is my unhurried feeling. And obviously this can vary a little bit from performance to performance. I simply want to say that if I'm going to try to recreate musically this feeling, I'm using the eighth note pulse in order to think of it. Going on to the melody, as I mentioned, it's an ornamented melody, and you can tell this because you have all of these very short note values, and there are a couple of things here that I'm doing. The first one has to do with these 30-second note values. Since this is not just a melody but an ornamented melody, the point is to not interpret it literally but somehow give it a forward momentum. You're going to hear many performances, especially on the piano, where each one of these notes is going to be given an equal importance, so that you may hear a line that sounds like this. And you can probably tell that this sounds a little awkward on the harpsichord. It's not because of the way I'm playing it. It's simply that the harpsichord is not meant to be able to sustain notes so much, so that trying to do this is awkward, and it kind of gives you a clue that this is not going to work that well. So what I would do first of all is this: not think of these notes literally. So instead of going, I'm going to keep the high B flat rather, a little longer. And then do kind of the same thing every time these 30-second notes appear. Etc. The other thing I would say is the grace notes, I play them in two different ways. The grace notes that are either half step or a whole step, I kind of think of this again, the concept of a Polonaise. I want to give it a little more energy, so I'm going to play them quite short. But then when we have the leap, because I want it to be expressive, I'm not going to go so fast, so I'm not going to do the same. Something a little more slow, so that it sounds like this, but I would still not do it in a literal way, which is again how you will hear many performances doing it. In other words, so I would do it this way. And there are places in the second section of this piece where Bach actually writes such leaps with proper notes, shall we say, so he doesn't use grace notes anymore. And to me it's important to kind of differentiate between the two. The other thing I would say, and this I will have to exaggerate a little bit so that you can hear it better, has to do with how to make this line not just one single gigantic line, which is again a 19th/20th century way of thinking about it, but rather to think of it in terms of short, expressive gestures. And I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit, but what I want you to notice is that every time we have notes that are tied, so for example, the B flat after the grace note, it's tied to the next one, and then I lift after the B flat. I don't actually continue. I don't keep holding it down and continue. But I think of it, here's one kind of gesture, and then, and I can do this when you have these tied notes, and also sometimes, this is something that again is a personal way of thinking about it, when you have all of these, you can again sometimes think of them not as continuous, but more. And if you think of it that way, it almost sounds like somebody that is sighing, or somebody that is about to cry and they can't really, you can't really talk, and you have to always stop because you feel like crying. So it's the same thing. It's almost like weeping. And you can't have a continuous thought when you're weeping. So I think of it in the same way. Let me play the right hand in the first line, and I'm going to exaggerate the separations just so you can hear where they are. Obviously, in a performance, I'm going to play them in a more musical way, and I'm also going to vary my approach. So right now, I'm just giving you the framework of the way I'm thinking about it. and I went a little further to the second line of the score. Incidentally, in the video description, I'm going to include 2 links. One of them is to the video of Wilhelm Friedemann Bach's Polonaise in E minor, and the second link will be to an earlier performance of the 25th variation that I posted several years ago. This is a live performance. In other words, you get to watch me playing it. Obviously, I like this more recent one a little better, but if you want to get an idea of what it looks like to play this piece on 2 manuals, this older performance is going to give you this idea. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.